So in my own work, I've looked at various areas where we could apply evolutionary theory to what would be considered, clinical phenomena. So in several of my books, I talk about dark side consumption, things like compulsive buying and eating disorders and pathological gambling and pornographic addiction. All of these things are maladaptive manifestations. And so the argument is, well, why do they exist? Of course, the social constructivist arguments are always wrong. So, for example, eating disorders arise because of media images. Well, of course, that's so laughably incorrect, because you got Hippocrates, who documented the exact same epidemiology of eating disorders, more than 2,000 years ago. And so I look at some of the biological reasons and evolutionary reasons why these maladaptive manifestations would arise. I've also looked at things like OCD from an evolutionary perspective, Munchausen syndrome by proxy from an evolutionary perspective, suicide from an evolutionary perspective. So, and I'm not a clinician, and yet I can clearly see the fertile possibilities between marrying evolutionary principles and clinical phenomena. Now, why do you think that is, that too few clinicians, whether they be certainly psychiatrists and or clinical psychologists, have not turned to the explanatory power of evolutionary theory in helping them in their clinical work?
Well, I think they have, in a more subtle manner. So, for example, if you look at people who study drug addiction, for example, I mean, the biology is just all over that.
Sure.
Like, so for example, it is, and it has for 40 years, the question has not been, why do people take drugs? That is the wrong question. We absolutely know why people take psychoactive substances like psychomotor stimulants. So that's cocaine and amphetamines, let's say, but heroin fits into that category to some degree, although it's also an analgesic, so it reduces pain. We know why people take anti-anxiety agents. We're a little bit less clear about the psychedelics, because they're strange. They're a whole different kind of motivational category. And it's hard to get animals to take psychedelics. But the reason that people take psychoactive drugs like cocaine is because they directly activate the dopaminergic system, and that's the primary pleasure circuit. And so, like, that's an evolutionary explanation. It's like you have an appetitive circuit. Most of the time it's after normal stimuli. There are super stimuli in the environment. Sugar is one. Gambling of certain sort is one. That's the random variable partial reinforcement schedules that slot machines use. Sexual stimuli are super stimuli, so that would account for pornography. The question isn't why people take drugs. It's why all people don't take drugs all the time. That's really the issue.
Because I'm high on life. I'm high on life, Jordan.
Well, look, but that is actually part of the answer, is that, like, if you take rats and you put them in a cage alone, you can get them to self-administer cocaine to the exclusion of all else, no problem. But if you put rats in a naturalistic rat environment, it's very difficult to get them to addict themselves to cocaine. And so part of the way that normal people, well-adapted people, avoid drug addiction is that they have better things to do. And that doesn't mean that those things are as exciting in the moment, but they balance the momentary excitement with the long-term cost, and presume that, 60% of ecstasy of an ecstatic state for 20 years beats the hell out of 100% of an ecstatic state for 1 year, followed by, a catastrophic life on the streets. And people are pretty good at regulating themselves that way. So having something better to do, I think, it's a primary treatment modality for addicts. It's not only, and Carl Jung made very much of this years ago. He said, look, if you're treating someone who has a serious psychiatric disorder, let's say alcoholism, you cure the damn disorder, but all you do is leave the person with a massive hole in their life. All their friends were alcoholics. All their social life circulated around alcohol and other drugs. It's like, so they need to find something better to do than the drugs. That's also why I think this future authoring program works so well for young men. It's like, well, you need an adventure, and cocaine is definitely an adventure. But, maybe you could come up with one that's a bit more sustainable and a bit more heroic and a little bit less self-destructive. And so having a purpose for your life is actually one of the things that naturally activates the dopaminergic tracts and makes the demand for excess psychomotor stimulant activation recede. So I think the evolutionary ideas have saturated themselves into clinical practice more than you might think, especially among the sophisticated clinicians.
Well, that's good.